Welcome to Robert Bellissimo at the Movies, where we explore all things cinema. I want to welcome to the show Nelson Aspen, who is a multi-award winning journalist, author, singer, host, and he has a new novel out called Kindred Spirits, a Titanic Tale. Nelson, welcome. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm an admirer of your program, so it's
Oh,
fun for me to get to be here with you instead of just listening to you. Now I get to talk with you instead of just listening to you.
yes. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. And I've been reading about your experiences over the year, and my God, you've done so many things. It's really impressive. And just off the top, because I know you as you mentioned, you've interviewed so many celebrities, and I was curious, is there a favorite for you? Is there a favorite interview?
Well, yeah, it has been a very busy 61 years, which explains why I'm so tired. But
Right.
I keep going. Yeah, that probably because I have interviewed literally thousands of
Yeah.
stars, from A list to Z list, and it doesn't matter A to Z. Good conversation is good conversation, as you well know.
Yes.
And when people ask me who are your best interviews, a lot of times actually people are more interested in who's the worst. Clickbait, any outlet that wants clicks
Yeah.
usually goes for the worst first. But the best, I always contend, and maybe it's because I was born way too late. I was born as a 30-year-old, and all of my taste and fandom lies with people that would be 30 years older than I am. So I tend to like the stars of the silver screen. And I was lucky that I started my career very early. I started as a child actor. So I got to meet a lot of the vintage, if we'll use that word, film stars like Olivia de Havilland and Glenn Ford and King Vidor. I mean, who knows King Vidor? Like, that's a reference that a lot of people
Yeah.
my age, and I'm old, wouldn't even know.
Right.
But to interview, I always contended that it was the older stars. Betty White was my very first celebrity interview, and she still, in my mind, was one of the best. Julie Andrews, Clint Eastwood, Eva Marie Saint,
Oh,
Rod Steiger. That because not only because they're great stars and great talents and have great bodies of work, but they, being of a certain age, have may we curse on your show?
yes.
All right. Those stars have no fucks left to give.
That's
So
true.
when you're interviewing someone, I don't know, let's just say over 70, they just have, it's not fair to say they don't have a filter, but they really have no reserve. And
Right.
they've got the best stories. Funny how it is that the older you get, the better stories you get. That just comes with life. So my default is always to say someone like a Julie Andrews, even Meryl Streep. She's old enough now to qualify.
Right.
So having a Meryl Streep, or Harrison Ford has a reputation as gruff and a curmudgeon. Tommy Lee Jones the same way. But you know what? If you get what you put out, that's what comes back to you. So yeah, it might be a little scary going into the room with Tommy Lee Jones, but after maybe 30 seconds, you're fine. And they do have the best stories to tell. I also like talking to directors and writers, which usually when I'm reporting for an outlet, they're not interested in hearing from the directors or writers unless it's a famous one like Steven Spielberg. But generally they just want the famous faces. But then every now and then they're not going to let you in with the famous face until you interview. You've got to suffer through the writer or director, and those are usually the ones that are the most personally fulfilling.
Mm, it's fascinating. I would love to be a fly on the wall with so many so many of those people, so many of those people you spoke to. You mentioned being a child actor. I noticed that you appeared in Ishtar,
I
the
did. Ishtar,
filmmaking,
known as
the
the
famous
worst
filmmakers.
movie ever made. Like,
Oh,
famously,
right, which is so untrue.
it is definitely untrue, and I'm so glad you brought that up. I don't think about Ishtar often, but it's not on my radar. That was the early '80s, I think, or the mid '80s, and I had a small bit part with like 3 lines that got cut. I mean, there are 3 shots of me that exist. Like if you watch the last 10 minutes of the film, you get to see me young and sort of chubby and with lots of hair. Although I played it was a military, they were performing on a military base. So I was a soldier. And I remember that they asked me to cut my hair, that if they could cut my hair in military fashion. And now when I look back on the film, I'm like, look at all that hair. Like now I wouldn't need it. Like it would just be fine. They'd be like, you're fine as it is. But I interviewed Warren Beatty not too terribly long ago. I would say maybe 6 or 7 years ago. And it was before COVID, but around that long ago. And when I walked into the room, I said to him, "My co-star," and he was like, what are you talking about?" And I'm like, "Yeah, we're both at Ishtar." And that's all he wanted to talk about. And he said,
Oh,
"You
wow.
know, that movie's got a bad rap." And I'm like, "Absolutely, it does." And there's a real subset of film fans who, like yourself, who know and
Yeah.
appreciate Ishtar for what it is.
Yes, yes, no, absolutely. And I'm curious because I love Elaine May so much. I know we'll get to Titanic soon, of course, for people waiting. But I was just how did she direct you? I mean, was she very specific with what you wanted, or did she give you free reign and work off of what you were doing, or just a little bit about that process?
If you watch the last 10 minutes where they're performing at this Middle Eastern military base, that's the scene that I was in, and it took 3 days to shoot that scene, but it was a crowd scene, and of course that was before AI. If you needed 200 people in a scene, you had to hire 200 people in a scene. There was no computer to generate people, so yeah, it was a crowd scene. It was almost DeMille-esque in its scope. So there were noises coming from above, kind of instructions and things like that. I just remember being starstruck by Isabella Johnny and Charles Grodin and Warren Beatty and Dustin Hoffman, and that was the big culmination scene. Although I didn't know at the time, I didn't know what. I just knew the scene. I didn't know where it would play out in the film. And at that point in my career, I was used to working in pictures that I'd go to see it in the theater and I was nowhere to be found. That's just how the cutting room floor works. And when you're
Very
starting out
common.
in your career,
I'm an actor
but
too. I know exactly what you mean.
yeah, I don't remember it as being a happy set. I'm sure there was a lot of pressure because it was way over budget. It was a big deal. There was a lot of expectation, and I think that's why it was unfairly criticized because the hype was so
Yes,
big
yes,
that it couldn't possibly live up to the hype.
right, right. No, it's fascinating. Fascinating. Yeah, the behind the scenes of that alone is could be a book, you know. But let's jump into Titanic. So before we get into your book, and we're gonna be talking about some of the Titanic movies, when did your fascination with the Titanic begin?
My Titanic obsession, and I've coined the expression Titaniac for any Titanic enthusiasts. We call ourselves the Titaniacs now. And for me, it began, I knew I'd always had an interest in ships and water, and maybe that just came from being a kid that had a pool in the backyard. So I was always playing with model ships and pretending to drown or swim or whatever have you. And then my life changed in December of 1971 when my parents gave me permission to go see the PG rated Poseidon Adventure.
Ah,
And I was so captivated with the film, the ships, the water, and an actress by the name of Carol Lindley that I began a trajectory toward not only a lifelong friendship with Carol Lindley that lasted from when I was a teenager is when I finally met her, and we became very close friends through my years living in New York and then Los Angeles and then back to New York until her passing in 2019. And I actually sort of became part of the Poseidon Posse, which we called ourselves because we would go to screenings and autograph shows with Ernest Borgnine and Stella Stevens and Roddy McDowall and Red Buttons and Ronald Neame. Shelley came to a couple of them. Irwin Allen's widow, Sheila, who had a bit part in the movie as the nurse with the suppositories. And and Carol would always say to me, just pretend you're Eric Shea, the little boy in the Poseidon Adventure, because we were about the same age. So I would just go along with it, and I'd be signing autographs as Eric Shea, just to be a part of this experience. But so I got captivated with the whole disaster at sea, but I had very specific identification with Titanic. And I am not one prone to the metaphysical and the woo-woo of reincarnation and past lives and other worlds. I'm a very pragmatic, historically minded human being. However, when happenstance and coincidence comes at you, if you're an open-minded person, you have to analyze it. And through a series of people, my whole life, I enunciate well. I'm a journalist and I'm on camera, and I pride myself on my speech. I don't think I mumble my name, Nelson. However, for decades, people mistakenly, whether it's a food order, a barista, or Dr. Robert Ballard, the oceanographer who discovered the wreck of the Titanic, people call me Milton.
Oh.
Milton, and it's very strange. When you're on the phone with a guy that discovered the Titanic and he goes, "Hello, Milton," you know something's up. Dreams, coincidences, my obsession, and it was hard to track down information before the internet. So I was the kid that was in the library, in the bookstores, looking at books of Titanic and trying to figure out what's my connection. And then a book by Wynne Craig Wade that I found in a South Street Seaport bookstore sometime in the early 80s had the name Milton Long. And Milton's death was described by the author just exactly as a recurring dream I had that was not scary. It was not a death dream, but it was a dream that was completely parallel to this description of Milton's death. Wow. So I became obsessed with tracking down Milton. There are thousands of stories about people on the Titanic that aren't about Molly Brown or Bruce Ismay or Thomas Andrews. You know, there was a whole civilization of people connected to Titanic that you've never heard of. Right. And Milton Long was one of them. And he's never really, there's a brief something in one of the TV movies, I think, but Milton Long's story has never been exploited. And that was how I came to write the book. I searched in every Titanic movie and book and documentary that I could get my hands on for information about Milton. Thank God for Google, but that really hasn't helped much because there really is very little backstory. So I wanted to tell the story of my connection to Milton. And I knew I would have to invent a backstory for Milton. I knew where he came from. I know how old he was. I knew that he went to both Harvard and Columbia, but never graduated. Why? I know where he was before he boarded the Titanic. Why? Why was his death certificate says that he was a gentleman of leisure? Why? Why is he buried in a crypt? They recovered his body. He's buried in a crypt with his two parents, but there were 8 plots for siblings they never had. So I created this backstory with him, and I decided, wouldn't it be something if 29-year-old Milton Long, that's how old he was when he perished, he didn't get to live out his life. And what if he came back through an extroverted, flamboyant, modern man who enjoys all that life has to offer. So it's an odd couple story. It's the repressed, uptight Edwardian, clenched in this world in which he lived, with a free-spirited modern man. And the two of them have to solve a great mystery, almost a ghost story, that involves a lost love in Titanic. And together they do it. The two souls, one body. So that's my story, Kindred Spirits, a Titanic tale. And I have a great time with it. And like all the film adaptations, James Cameron did basically Romeo and Juliet on the Titanic. So my story is a reincarnation story, but you have some of those historical figures tangentially. So you get to rub elbows with them, past and present, because nobody ever really goes away in the world I've created. So Molly Brown's not only on the Titanic in 1912, but she's a figure in modern Manhattan as well. All these spirits are still around us. So it's a wonderful contribution for me to make to the Titanic legacy, because I've been a fan for my entire life.
Well, such a fascinating concept for a book, and the fact that it's so personal to you from your experiences. I think not only Titanic fans, but just book fans in general.
And I had never done historical. This is my ninth book,
Right.
and most of my books are nonfiction. I did two recent memoirs, which I fictionalized only to avoid lawsuits, and also because my memory ain't what it used to be. So I sort of moved some things around. But with this book, doing a historical fantasy, the reason I didn't do it just exactly as my story, which I
Yeah.
just touched on with you, was because my publisher, interestingly, said, your last two books were period pieces, because my life is old enough. Yeah, I'm old enough that my life is a period piece. So he said, I love the idea, but set it in 2025. You can go back to 1912, but make it a current contemporary story. And that's why I've constructed it the way I have. A fascinating challenge to write a historical fantasy. It would be easy to write exactly what happened with me and Milton,
Right.
but this was a whole new challenge, and I am blessed that I was given a great editor who specializes in fantasy, who sort of taught me the rules, the goal. I mean, if you're going to create a fantasy world, you have to enforce a strict structure of rules and laws and things like that. And so I learned about that, because if you break the rules that you've set up for yourself just for the convenience of a plot twist, the readers, you'll lose them. The fantasy lovers are paying attention. And I feel like, you know what? I gave Milton not only some recognition after 113 years, but I gave him a story that I think he would be proud of. I hope so. I hope Milton, wherever he is.
Well, it's interesting because I heard you say in another podcast that you don't believe in reincarnation, even though you've
No.
had this experience. So I'm curious why that doesn't make you a believer.
I can only believe it for myself. If
Uh,
somebody else came up to me and said, actually, I did speak to a gentleman through the Titanic community. Somebody said, "Oh, yeah, you should talk to so and so. He's reincarnated from somebody on the Titanic." And I'm like, "Okay." And I was like, I got in touch. Who were you? And with all due respect, he just said to me that he was Molly Brown. And I was like, well, of course. And that there's even a joke about that in the book, when my character says, "Dad, I'm reincarnated from someone on the Titanic," and the father says, "Yeah, who were you, Molly Brown?" Because when you talk to people who say they're reincarnated, they were always like Cleopatra
right.
or Napoleon.
Yeah.
Nobody was just, the schmuck from down the street. So,
Now I know, of course, you also have the podcast Titanic Talk, so
yes.
you know a lot about the Titanic, and you've seen all the various films, which we're going to touch on today. So why don't I just saw of course I'd seen Titanic with DiCaprio and Kate Winslet, but I hadn't seen A Night to Remember or Titanic, the 1953 version. So I'll just read a brief synopsis
Yeah.
for the 53. This was directed by Jean Negulesco. An unhappily married Julia Sturgis decides to go to America with their two children on the Titanic. Her husband, Richard, also arranges passage on the luxury liner so as to have custody of their two children. All this fades to insignificance once the ship hits an iceberg. This starred Clifton Webb, Barbara Stanwyck, Robert Wagner, Audrey Dalton, Thelma Ritter, Richard Basehart. It has a really, really wonderful cast. It was actually also produced by Charles Brackett, who, for anyone, if that doesn't ring a bell right away, or if it does, he was the wrote many, many screenplays with Billy Wilder. So he wrote it with Walter Reich and Richard L. Breen. So Well, how do you feel about this version? I just saw it. I liked it. It's not my favorite, but of but I thought it was pretty good. I was curious your feelings on this one.
Yeah, it's really well done. It's got an amazing cast. They take, aside from the fictional story with Barbara Stanwyck and Clifton Webb, they they play fast and loose with
Yeah.
facts. Like Thelma Ritter kind of plays Molly Brown, but they don't
Yeah.
call her Molly Brown. So I don't really quite understand when you have, I never understood that with the James Cameron film, quite frankly. When you have the true story that is so effective, what do you need to fictionalize? It's not necessary. James Cameron made it work, I think, mainly because of his attention to everything else. The production values were so terrific that you sort of took the fictional story with a grain of salt. Barbara Stanwyck and Clifton Webb are so amazingly talented
Yeah.
that they give credibility to the performance. As those films go of its era, the special effects were really good.
Yeah.
And Robert Wagner, to me, is a revelation. Robert Wagner is still alive in his
Yes.
90s. And in this film, he was really, I mean, if you don't believe that youth is beauty,
Mm.
look at Robert Wagner in this movie. He is prettier than his love interest. He is this most exquisite young man. I would like to believe that maybe that's what Milton looked like on the Titanic. But it's highly entertaining. It's a popcorn film, and in my book, in Kindred Spirits, in the quest for trying to figure out the modern guy, what's happening to me? Why am I suddenly out of nowhere obsessed with the Titanic? He goes to see a double feature of Titanic with Barbara Stanwyck and A Night to Remember with Kenneth More. So and he goes through the Poseidon Adventure. He goes to a James Cameron Titanic convention. You know, all of those elements of pop culture. And Titanic has been a part of pop culture since it
Yeah.
sank.
Yeah.
And a survivor was a silent film actress named Dorothy Gibson. She got off the Titanic,
Yes.
saved her outfit, and made a silent film version of the disaster. It was the first Titanic film, and she actually was wearing in the silent film the outfit she wore when she was
I
rescued.
read that.
So, yeah, it's just always, it will always be there. And you can be as critical as you want of Jim Cameron's 97 version, but you know what? It reignited the passion for the story.
Yeah.
And every generation has its Titanic moment. It is not supposed to be a romantic event. It
Right.
was a disaster
Yeah.
of 9/11 proportion. It
Yeah.
was a world-shaking disaster that ended the Edwardian era because it proved that we're not superior to nature. Technology, we think we mastered technology. No, it sank. The unsinkable sank.
Right.
So you wouldn't make a Romeo and Juliet out of 9/11 or
Mm.
the Challenger explosion or a tsunami. But there's something about Titanic because it represents a time that won't be back. Gone with the Wind sort of did that. It romanticized the end of an era.
Yeah.
Very few disasters could do that.
Mm. No, I completely agree. But I thought the fictional story they have in the 53 version is pretty compelling. I mean, you have this couple, and it's really about such problems that are very common, which is, two people love each other, but then they don't agree with how to parent, and that can really sort of lead to divorce. And I know people who have divorced for similar reasons. But I thought and the class element comes in because Clifton Webb is such a snob, and he married Stanwyck's character, who was like this working class woman, and so that's a big, how to raise the children is such a big conflict. But it unfortunately took facing death and hitting this iceberg for them to realize, no, we do really love each other. And we see that with that part where he finds out that his son is not really his son, and he's going to disown him. But then in the end, he's hugging him, and as the ship's going down. So sure, it's
Oh,
sentimental.
it's
You know,
very sentimental,
yeah,
but
right,
in a way, it was groundbreaking in its themes, not just for 1912, the idea of an illegitimate child, the idea
Yes.
of divorce, that was not commonplace in 1912. But the film was made in 1953. So I mean, my parents were divorced from their first spouses in the early 60s. In 1953, divorce was not thrown around lightly either.
It's a good
So
point.
it was pretty racy for its
Yeah.
time.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And even though the ending when they're all singing as it's about to sink, I'm like, anyone who's seen either A Night to Remember or Titanic, the DiCaprio and Winslet one, or just knows about it, knows that that's not what happened. But it's still, I was finding myself still so moved by it. There's so, as opposed to what we know is that everybody was still running naturally, trying to find a way to survive. And there was something about the fact that we're not going to survive, so we'll go down singing. It was quite
Well,
moving.
I'd like to think if I'm ever put in that position, maybe I'll just whistle a tune and
Right.
whatever. It's the great unknown. Death is the great unknown.
Yeah.
How will we handle it? Will we rise to the occasion? Will it be scary? Will it be painful? Will we be prepared? We spend our entire lives
Yeah.
wondering
Yes.
about that ultimate event. So something like Titanic, no matter what movie version you or novel version you read, it raises that question. What would I do?
Right.
How would I behave?
Right.
And Clifton Webb behaves like a gentleman. The famous line from that was in Walter Lord's original novel, upon which the film A Night to Remember was based, talked about Benjamin Guggenheim, who was one of the wealthiest men in the world, and he was traveling with his French mistress, who I believe was pregnant, while his wife was at home. He and his valet were on the Titanic with his mistress, and she got off. But famously, as we saw in the movie versions, he dressed in his tuxedo and said, "We are dressed as gentlemen and prepared to go down
Right.
as such," and did that, a code of honor. And there's something inspirational. All right, you philandering white collar person, but you died with dignity, and that was important to the men of 1912. The men who survived the Titanic, I might point out, did not go on to have happy lives. Many committed suicide. Many
Yes.
lived with survivor's guilt,
Mm,
post-traumatic stress. Surviving the Titanic did not mean a happy ending.
right. That's a book and a movie in itself. I would love to see that.
You have to look no
Yeah.
further.
There you go. One day we'll see it as a film, hopefully, or a series.
Well, hopefully.
We'll see what happens. And then, of course, the after that is A Night to Remember. So this was 58, and I'll read a brief synopsis. The sinking of the Titanic is presented in a highly realistic fashion in this tense British drama. The disaster is portrayed largely from the perspective of the ocean liner's second officer, Charles Lightoller. Despite numerous warnings about ice, the ship sails on, with Captain Edward John Smith keeping it going at a steady clip. When the doomed vessel finally hits an iceberg, the crew and passengers discover that they lack enough lifeboats, and tragedy follows. This starred Kenneth Moore. I'll just read some of the cast: Kenneth Moore, Ronald Allen, Robert Ares, Honor Blackman, Anthony Bushell, John Kearney, I believe, Jill Dixon. It was directed by Roy Ward Baker. It was written by Eric Ambler. Um, what are your thoughts on A Night to Remember?
I love this film, and
Me too.
knowing I was going to be talking to you, I rewatched it for maybe the 20th time the other day. Uncredited cast member, we should point out, is Bernard Fox, who recently passed away. In the film, he plays the lookout who spots the
Oh,
iceberg,
right.
who rings down. Now, Bernard Fox is best remembered as Dr. Bombay on Bewitched.
Ah,
Dr. Bombay, emergency, come right away. He was the
oh,
witch
perfect.
doctor. But in Night to Remember, he's the lookout. And if you see James Cameron's Titanic, he appears as Colonel Archibald Gracie. He's
Oh, I
got a
didn't know
few
that.
lines. So he has the distinction of having been in two Titanic films. So it's a fun fact. And I double checked, and Bernard Fox is not credited in A Night to Remember. And it's a glaring omission.
Ah,
So A Night to Remember is and it really is more like a documentary than a
yes,
film,
yes.
but the elements of Titanic's story perfectly point out my case that you don't need to fictionalize anything
Oh,
because it's so moving
yeah.
just as it is. The class distinctions, the demographics, the time, the hubris. It is beautifully done. It's a small movie, but its attention to detail is great. The special effects are very admirable.
Yes.
And it's based on Walter Lord's book, A Night to Remember. Walter Lord lived many, many years after that and went on to write a sequel about the night to remember, about that night to remember. Uh, so it was faithfully adapted from Lord's novel, which is why it's so realistic. It's hyper realistic and probably your best accounting of what, although the ship does not split in two,
Right.
and James Cameron has acknowledged that his splitting of in two is not what happened. It has been proven otherwise since then, but it was so dark. And once the lights went out, you wouldn't have seen what the hell happened anyway. The only reason we really know what happened is the forensic analysis of the wreck. Uh, so, in A Night to Remember, there are so many iconic moments. And if you haven't seen it, I would tell your viewers to check it out. And there are going to be so many moments you'll go, wait a minute, where have I seen that before? I've seen that in James Cameron's Titanic.
Yeah.
And I'm not accusing Cameron of plagiarism. I'm saying those are indelible images that were created in Night to Remember that Cameron had either filed away or decided were too effective not to use, or maybe he decided it was an honorific
Mm.
tribute to the film. But yeah, it's fantastic, and there's some liberties taken at the beginning. There's some liberties taken at the end, but it gets the heartstrings tugged in all the right places.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, this was actually the first time I'd ever seen it. I hadn't seen it before, and I really enjoyed it. And the class differences really come through in this one. I mean, down to just looking up the character again. Is it the yeah, Second Officer Charles Herbert, who we see on this train at the beginning, and he is such a snob. He talks about the people in the lower classes like, oh, they don't even wash. I thought, what a horrible thing to say. And then he winds up being such a hero. I mean, he saves so many people. But we see that really came through for me really, really strong because the people who the working class or in the lower class on the boat, they are the most unselfish ones. You know, the one married older couple where the guy says, "Well, I'm not going to take a boat before any other man here. I'm not going to take that privileged position." Whereas you see the way, I mean, it played comedically in a sense because you see the way a lot of the very wealthy people in the first class were complaining about the how the life jackets looked on them. They
Oh,
were
and it's so
incredible.
cold.
Yeah, oh,
I'm
it's
going
so
back
cold.
inside. It's too cold. Well, the denial of like nothing bad can happen on the
Yeah,
ship.
that was
We're safer on the ship than we are in the lifeboat. And thinking this doesn't necessarily just apply to the Titanic, but the ships that were crossing the Atlantic at that time, while yes, we perceive the luxury of the first class, the business of shipping was steerage. It was getting people. The real money was made by the people in third class in steerage. That's where they made their money. That's what enabled them to decorate the first class
right.
opulently. So it was an immigrant trade. And the irony is, and we all know that the Titanic didn't have enough lifeboats on board, but they actually had more lifeboats than they were legally obligated to carry.
Oh,
Frustratingly,
Wow.
Frustratingly, yeah, because it was based on tonnage. And like if a ship was a certain tonnage, then they had to have X number of lifeboats. The Titanic was carrying more lifeboats than they were obligated by law to have, which is why some of them were unfilled. They were just like they thought, oh well, they'll be coming back on.
Right, right, right.
This isn't going to end the way it ended up ending. So they were like, oh, we'll put some people out in the boats, and then we'll bring them back later when we've balanced out, which of course didn't happen. So and then ironically, once the ship was gone, the people in the lifeboats, some people wanted to go back. Let's go back and pick up the people in the water, but once you're, hey, I'm not going to literally don't rock the boat. I'm not going to go back and get swamped. And the semi-orderly fashion in which the boats were loaded until the end, when things got unruly, that's another thing that wouldn't happen in modern times. There'd be no women and children first. Imagine that happening in 2025. You can't even get into an elevator now without a bloodbath. Everybody's would
Yeah.
be I'm getting on next, or pulling out weapons. I don't know. It was unique to its time.
Mm. But it makes me wonder all those warnings they got about iceberg and the captain just like not thinking it was that big of a deal. I mean, even if the boat didn't sink, I mean, wouldn't you want to avoid hitting an iceberg? Even if they're like, oh, if we hit it, we won't sink. I don't understand why this. Is there any indication as to why they did this?
It was a different time, and interestingly, my character of Milton Long had been in a shipwreck previously.
Oh wow.
And so we knew that historically that he had been in another. So people and a lot of the crew that survived Titanic went on to other ships that had shipwrecks. Like when there was no air travel, I mean,
Wow.
you took ships. So mishaps, if you want to call them mishaps, but whatever, at sea were not completely out of the ordinary. And the ship, Titanic specifically, Thomas Andrews designed it in mind with ice in the North Atlantic route which they would take. And the ship was designed, and the irony is, if the ship had hit the iceberg head on, we wouldn't be sitting here talking about it today because it would have been all right. It was designed that it could survive and float and keep going with its first forward
Right.
compartments flooded. The fact that they thought, oh, we got to miss it, like turn, that was the mistake. They'd been better off running into it because
Oh,
turning got it on the side and opened up enough flooding
right.
capacity for more than four watertight compartments.
Mhm.
As for the ice warnings, and Night to Remember does this brilliantly.
Yes, yes.
It takes us to other ships in the area that were receiving the same ice warnings. Some decided, well, we'll slow down. Some decided, we'll stop for the night and we'll turn our radio off.
Yes.
But with Titanic, there was not only the assumption that they could go through ice without an issue. There was also the fact that this was their maiden voyage. The hype, we see this till, we've learned nothing. We have learned nothing in 113 years. The hype of the Titanic is the newest, grandest, the most luxurious. And there was a new hot thing on Titanic, Marconi. And you could send messages from the ship to your loved ones back in England or in New York. You could say, have the car waiting for me when I dock in New York. And there was so much messaging going on through the wireless telegraph room that a lot of the ice warnings, and that's depicted in the movie too, they're swamped sending personal messages from the
Yes.
passengers, that
Yes.
the ice warnings get buried under the
Yeah.
other,
Right.
they're not prioritized. So it's a different world. I guess the most we could identify with that would be like, oh, I missed your text message.
Yeah.
I erased the voicemail. It was a mishap of unique to its time.
Right. And even at the end, you see the second officer, says, "Oh, we didn't sink because we hit the iceberg. We sunk because we didn't think it could ever sink." And I thought that's so on the nose. But
And now here, what was it, a year or two ago? The submersible,
yes,
the
God.
Titanic tourism. I mean, it was even called the Titan, which I think, you got to be asking for trouble if you're naming your submersible the Titan to go down to the Titanic.
God.
But here we were, over 100 years later. The Titanic is still killing people because they think they can conquer Mother Nature. Like, okay, I'm going to pay $1 zillion for the privilege of going down in this tin can to go look at a grave. That's what you're doing. You're looking at a grave, is what you're doing. Get a snorkel and go look at the coral reef. But to go down to that, to a grave site, and I have very strong opinions about the fact that it's deteriorated to the point of where it's going to soon just be dust
Right,
anyway.
right.
You've taken all the pictures. Dr. Robert Ballard agrees with me on this, the oceanographer who discovered the wreck. You've taken all the pictures you can. We have the gift of AI now. We can recreate the wreck in all of its stages of decomposition. So you can go that way. You don't need to take your life in your hands and dive down to it.
Um,
The fact that it broke open is why the debris field is so extensive. When the ship broke, everything came tumbling out. Everything was scattered on the ocean floor. That's actually how Ballard found it. He found the ship because he was following the debris field. So I'm not against excavating teacups and toilets and boots from the ocean floor. To me, that's fair game because it's on the ocean floor. But I think the wreck needs to be undisturbed.
mm. No, I completely agree with you. But that was certainly my favorite of the three, which leads me to the one we all know the most, Titanic, 1997. A 17-year-old aristocrat falls in love with a kind but poor artist aboard the luxurious, ill-fated RMS Titanic. This was directed and written by James Cameron. It's got a great cast. Leonardo DiCaprio, Kate Winslet, Billy Zane, Kathy Bates, Francis Fisher, Gloria Stewart, Bill Paxton, Victor Garber. The list goes on and on. So this one, of course, I was 10 when it came out. I still remember my parents took me and my brother to go see it. And as soon as the scene where Kate Winslet was naked, my mother covered my eyes. But I remember liking it as a kid, and I still like it, but I am not. I mean, why it was such? I mean, I can understand it being a hit, but why it got all these Oscars and it's could I just think it's really, first of all, it's too long. The love story is so black and white and cheesy and overly sentimental, even though that music with Celine Dion, it's so well done. But I'm like, did this really need to be this long?
It would have been 6 or 7 hours longer. I mean, James overshot that movie and told
Yeah,
so many other really interesting real stories that never made it
I,
to the film. I mean, talk about Ishtar. There was a lot left behind that even the special features, if you were to get the DVD, they don't even cover it. There were whole
oh, I
stories
didn't
and
know that.
plots. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, there were six Chinese survivors. There's a wonderful book by a colleague of mine, Stephen Schwenkert, called The Six.
Oh,
And he did a documentary about finding the descendants of the six Chinese passengers who, that's where James Cameron got the idea for Kate floating on the door panel, it wasn't a door, it was a panel. That's how a Chinese survivor survived.
oh
And
wow.
because of Chinese clothing, wardrobe, that's how they were. And men surviving. If you were a man and survived, you were suspect. Let alone the bias against minorities such as Asians. Asians
Right.
were really persecuted at that time in the Western world, and their clothes led some people to accuse them of disguising themselves as women to get into the boats. But
Mm,
it was actually their clothing that made them, look like they were trying to pass themselves off as women, which wasn't the case. Anyway, the six that's a whole other story. And James Cameron was very interested in that as
Oh,
well.
I didn't
So
know that.
yeah, there are many untold stories, and that's why it was important for me to tell Milton's story. I do know ABC about Milton, but I wanted the rest of the alphabet. So I took what I had and went with it. And tangentially, a lot of his close friend on board was a young man, also 17. As Kate Winslet, you said her character was 17, a 17-year-old from Philadelphia named Jack Thayer. And Jack survived and lived until he was 50 and was so traumatized by the events that he took his own life when he was 50. You just, even from 17 to 50, he never got over the
Oh,
Titanic. So I go into a lot of that in my book, while still making it entertaining. And I also, someone was saying, your other books can get kind of racy. Is that like that? Yeah. And I'm like, well, if they'd had Grinder on the Titanic, they probably would have used it. Kate Winslet and Leonardo
that's
DiCaprio
what they would have
had,
meant.
they did it in the car down in the cargo hold.
Right,
So, I guarantee you, people had sex on the Titanic.
for sure. Sure they did.
So it happens in my book. I always like to add a little sex.
Yeah, why not? Why not? But yeah, I showed it. We showed it to my son not too long ago because he wanted to see it, and I just think even like comparing it, like on the surface, yeah, it's Romeo and Juliet on the Titanic, but it's like a condensed, simplistic Romeo and Juliet.
Yeah.
The
I
good.
don't I don't know why Billy Zane didn't have a mustache to twirl. It
Oh God,
really He should have had a mustache to twirl. But
yeah,
hey, it's a good time. It's a popcorn movie for
for sure.
sure. And
For sure.
what was your son? How old is your son, and what was his reaction?
He really liked it, like
Of
I did
course.
as a kid.
There you go. Another Titaniac sucked
There you
in.
go.
That's how we get them. It's the gateway drug.
Yeah, it's the way in. But yeah, I mean, it's enjoyable. But I've from what you're saying, I imagine you're not the biggest fan, or
Well,
maybe.
I saw it in the theater 8 times. I was
Oh
living
wow,
in Los Angeles. I helped my friend write her audition that got her the role
wow.
because, again, this was before the internet, and it was 1996 when she auditioned for that film. And she said, "We have to write a monologue from the point of view of a passenger. Who the fuck knows anything about the Titanic?" And I'm like, I do. I'll help you write this monologue." And she got a part and spent three
Wow.
months in Mexico on the set.
Who was
And
she in it?
she plays first class woman. She
Oh, okay.
also, she had lines, they got
Yeah.
cut,
Oh, I see.
but she has like
No,
three or
she's in it.
four
Right.
very prominent moments in the film. Most notably when DiCaprio comes into the dining room in his tuxedo. She's the redhead that gives him the once over. Like, she looks right in the camera, point of view
Ah,
Leonardo DiCaprio, and cocks her eyebrow like, "Oh, what's coming in the door here?"
very
Uh,
nice.
but she has since made a documentary about reuniting other smaller cast members of the
Oh, I'd
film
love
to
to see
talk
that.
about their experience. I'll,
Yeah,
I'll set you up.
yeah.
And but it is the gateway drug. Like, here she was, she didn't know anything about Titanic, and here's your 10-year-old son who doesn't know anything about Titanic, and here we go. We're all in this together, and
Yeah. Good
another
point.
generation will keep the torch lit.
Yeah, good point. I mean, it got me really interested in it at the time. And I still, even though I've just from preparing, talking to you, I learned more. But I've always been fascinated by it, and that movie was the launching pad, right? So, thank
And
you
I felt that
James,
way
for
about Poseidon Adventure. The Poseidon Adventure, as camp as it is, it stands up still. It's better than most of the disaster films of its
yeah,
era.
I agree.
And they did two remakes of Poseidon Adventure, one for television and one on the big screen with Wolfgang Peterson. Come on, it should have been good.
Right.
And neither of them can hold a candle to the original.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with you there. And how many other Titanic movies are there? I read 8.
Yeah,
Something like
I
that.
actually I pulled it up on Wikipedia. They're starting with that silent one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11,
Oh wow, so
12,
more than I thought.
13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19.
Oh
And
my God.
that's not the documentaries; those are films. So
Wow.
there you go.
Wow. I didn't know it was that many, but
Most of them are not worth it.
right, right, yeah. But these, for anyone who, particularly if people haven't seen A Night to Remember, that's if I could only pick one for people to see here, that's certainly the one to go with. It's really, really, really wonderful.
And the book is wonderful. The novel by Walter Lord on
Yeah,
which it is based
I have to
is
read that.
marvelous. And I'm getting up. I'm not leaving you. I'm walking over to my bookshelf because I know I have it here. I'm getting
Okay.
it. I'm getting it. Here you go. Another book I highly recommend. This is my first edition.
Oh,
Paul Gallico's Poseidon Adventure.
oh,
The book,
fantastic.
and it's amazing that they made the movie because the book is extraordinary, and it was based on his crossing the Atlantic on the Queen Mary, and a rogue wave came and almost capsized the ship.
Wow.
And he imagined, like, oh, well, what if it had actually happened? And that's how he wrote the novel. And they filmed the exterior shots for the Poseidon Adventure on the Queen Mary. I mean, it was exactly what Paul Gallico had envisioned. And the Queen Mary, of course, is now famously docked in Long Beach, California. I was doing an interview years ago with Pamela Sue Martin, who was in the Poseidon Adventure, best known for the Nancy Drew Mysteries and Dynasty. She was Fallon on Dynasty. And we were trying to coordinate where to do the interview, and I said, can we do it on the deck of the Queen Mary? And I called the Queen Mary and they said yes. And
Oh,
Pamela Sue said yes. And we did the
wow.
interview there. And I mean, come on. That was, for a Poseidon kid like me, that was a thrill.
Oh, that's incredible. That's incredible. Now, if people want to get the book, where's the best place for them to go?
Quickest, easiest, go to Amazon, go to barnesandnoble.com. Kindred Spirits, A Titanic Tale. You should have no problem doing it. I'm launching a series of book signings that will kick off on board the Queen Mary for the
Oh,
Titanic anniversary weekend. So I'll be doing Long Beach, Los Angeles, Boston, New York,
wow.
Baltimore. Then I'm heading to London in May, and I'm going to wrap it up at the end of May, although I don't want to say I'll wrap it up because I'll keep going if I can. I'm trying to work on some Hong Kong and Sydney, Australia dates. But Belfast, where Titanic was built, when the last time I was in Belfast, there was nothing there. It was basically, a rather sad, lonely little city with the Harland and Wolff shipyards that were largely unused. And now, and maybe you have to give Jim Cameron some credit for this, Belfast is a kick-ass, thriving, beautiful place dominated by the Titanic Museum, the Titanic Hotel, and the
Wow.
Titanic Distillers. And I'll be going there at the end of May, and I can't wait to
Oh,
see these places. I've been watching them from afar as they've taken shape and risen from the ghosts of Titanic. So it's really thrilling.
that's great. That's great. I'm sure you'll have a ball. Sounds like
Yes. Everything's on nelsonaspen.com. You can find out, links to the book, links to the book tour, links to the podcast, Titanic Talk. So, I'm the easiest person in the world to find.
great. And I will leave all of those links in the description
Thank
box.
you.
Oh, along with Nelson's social media handles, if you want to follow him on Instagram and such. So, Nelson, thank you so much. This was such a great chat.
Yeah, you got me started and I couldn't stop. And I'm so honored to be talking to you because you're so good at what you do, and
Oh, thank you.
your enthusiasm for all the genres of film is important. I knew when you posted Bunny Lake is Missing, we were going to be friends.
Oh, great. Yeah, really, really good one. Well, thank you so much. Coming from you with someone with your experience and expertise, that means a lot. So thank you so
Well,
much.
I'll leave you with one thought. People say, do you want to go to the movies with me? I'm like, you got to be out of your mind. For my work, I had to see so many movies over the years, but I always pointed out nobody sees more bad movies than I do because
Right,
to interview so and so or review it, you had
right.
to see
Yeah,
it. So
yeah,
I'm now in a position where I can pick and choose, so I
right.
don't have to see all the bad stuff anymore.
Good, good. Yeah, that would be hard. I would if I was a
Well,
traditional critic, I think I'd have a hard time with that. Uh, But this has been great. So I hope that you can come again sometime down the road. Uh,
Thank you. I'll be back anytime you want me.
Great. Best of luck with the book launch. And for those of you watching, thanks so much, and we will see you in the next one. I want to thank all of my members on Patreon. If you're interested in becoming a member of my Patreon, head over to the link patreon.com/RobertBellissimo at the movies for full details. You can also leave a donation or what I call a tip by clicking the thanks link, which you will find directly below the video frame. Just click on that and you can leave a donation if you choose to. Of course, I would greatly appreciate that. And lastly, if this is your first time here, please consider subscribing. It is absolutely free to do so. By pressing the Robert Bellissimo at the movie logo, you will see it floating above my head in the top left corner to your top left. In just a second, just click on that. And then click the bell in order to get a notification every time I release one of my new videos. I would also really appreciate if you leave a comment, share the video, like the video. All of these things create traction onto my YouTube channel and really help share the video far and wide and the channel in general. So thank you so much for doing that, and I will see you all in the next one.